Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from Nigeria, where I'm recording this talk. I'm going to talk about Idu and the directional terms. Idu is a language of Northeast India, which turns out to have extraordinary variety of directional terms. I'm going to have a look at how they evolve in relation to the physical terrain of the Idu and how they're used in terms of orientation, etc. So obviously the idea that the natural environment in which people live has a strong impact on the grammatical and semantic systems they've evolved goes back at least 100 years to Sapir. But if you look through the literature on directionality, it's quite sparse, partly because most languages typically studied are plains or maritime people. So where you do have, for example, focus on spatial terminology, and this is very common in Austronesian, just to give some references here, these tend to be cardinal directions and stuff that's more useful in relation to islands, currents and winds. Antoinette Schapper does deal explicitly, however, with elevation in the Alor-Pantar languages. In the Himalayan region, a few studies have described directional, perhaps not quite under that name. Mark Post wrote an article on topographical deictics for the Tani languages, which are just to the west of Idu. And these are likely to be prominent, obviously, in cultures living in steep environments where up and down, north and south are more relevant than conventional cardinals. Okay, so the Idu people of Arunachal Pradesh live in vertiginous territory. It goes all the way from the plains of the Brahmaputra Valley to the Tibetan High Plateau. However, there was a pretty major earthquake in 1951, and before that, there were basically no settlements on the plain. The general pattern was rather dispersed settlement along 6 main river valleys, and these correspond even today to the 6 main lineages of the Idu. In this area of Arunachal, the inclines are particularly steep, and almost all movement would have been up and down the mountainside and across the many rivers which cut through their territory. As a consequence, the Idu language evolved to reflect this pattern of orientation. But what happened after the earthquake was that many villages were swallowed up and individuals made homeless. So they moved down to the plain, and they now live among Assamese and Nepalese resident there. So there is now, as it were, a certain dissonance, if you like, between the terminology in the language and post-earthquake geography. So just to give you an idea of Idu territory, this is where the Idu actually live today. Roying is the capital of the Idu, and it's of course on the plains rather than in the mountains. There was a continuous band of Idu settlement into the southern fringes of the Tibetan Plateau. However, the creation of a large national park in this region meant that there was no further Idu settlement. The small number of Idu villages were cut off in Tibet, and I understand have recently been moved away from the border to new cultural settlements or something like that, which the intention of which presumably is to make the Idu lose their culture in China. Idu people in India are pretty dissatisfied with the situation, but not much to be done about it. Okay, expressing directionality and elevation and so on. So perhaps surprisingly, movement verbs relating to elevation are not marked for directionality and are thus pretty much the same to English, go up, go down, and so on. Similarly, basic deictics are similarly restricted. They don't seem to have any implied directionality. But directionals, therefore, are a vocabulary of a different type, and they're based on orientation towards the mountains and the plains, the rivers and the village, as well as a left-right-handedness distinction. And the paper concludes there's a strong relationship between the lexical richness of this and the physical environment of the Idu. So I've been gathering data for this paper in a series of field trips to Edo territory between 2015 and 2020. And I'd particularly like to thank Mite Linge and Hindu Memi both for help with working on understanding directionals and in developing the transcription of the Edo language. Okay, just to mention the movement verbs, clearly the natural environment of the Edo people ensures that the semantic merger between climb and other more usual forms of ascension. So climb and go up, as well as climb down and go down, use the same verb, marking elevation, but do not incorporate directionality. So here's the example of the word shoot, to climb, to go up, to ascend. Similarly, perhaps more alarmingly, the verb to go down and to descend are merged with the verb to fall. This has a particular resonance for Edo speakers, as falling off a mountain is a particular type of death for which a particular level, specific level of the underworld is reserved. So there's a strong association between this verb and the soul leaving the body, but directionality is obviously not playing a part here. Similarly with dialectics, you have here and there, and these don't seem to have any marking for direction or orientation. Okay, so here's the core subject of the talk, the categories of Edo directionals. Broadly speaking, they look syntactically, at least they look like adverbs. They're defined, there was prior to the main verb of the sentence. They are broadly defined from the point of view of the speaker. And I've created 5 categories: verticality, up and down in relation to the position of the speaker; cardinals, that's north, south, east, and west, although, as I argue, these are probably modernized interpretations of more traditional terms; rivers, so there's a whole class of words describing upstream, downstream, this bank and the opposite bank, and so on; villages, so you have terms that tell you orientation in relation to the upper village and the lower village; and finally, right and left. So verticality directionals describe the relationship of an entity in relation to the speaker in terms of up and down. And the markers identified to date are given in this table here. So we have Adri and Ama, Ayuma, Ayumanyu, Etolo, and Etolunyu. So you have all these words meaning downwards, and also concept of towards downwards, in other words, sort of down that way in a rather vaguer way. So I've tried to represent this on a sort of diagram showing, as it were, the sort of proper downwards, and which has a wider range, if you like, in terms of where something is, and direct down and direct up in the same way. So all of these relate back to ego at the center. Okay, if you remember where the Edo people are, then north and south broadly correspond to up and down in terms of the mountains. Now, it's fairly clear that these is a recent reinterpretation of the lexicon, that prior to modern times, the terminology simply referred to up and down the mountains. And both for up and down, they have 3 degrees of proximity. Now, one marker of this is the fact that there are no distinctive terms for east and west, rather terms which mean sideways in either direction. So unlike the up-down terms, they include a direct deictic element here and there, as well as proximity to the speaker, which suggests that this was not an original system of cardinals, in contrast, for example, to Tibetan. So here is the table of cardinals, at least today. So of north and south, and more vaguer terms, up there north, up there on top, and up there, and those also relate largely to proximity, and you have a parallel system of terms going southwards. Here are the terms are over there, which are both east and west. And there's these, that means essentially, you could think of that as meaning sideways, and these also have a proximity form. So I've also represented this as a typical diagram, with east and west being essentially the same term, the terms going up and down from ego in relation to the mountain, which are now interpreted in modern terms as north and south. Riverine directionals. So Edo territory was dissected by massive rivers, most of which flowed seasonally from the Tibetan Plateau, following the snow melt in the spring. So in former times, well, even today sometimes, communities could be seasonally isolated or only accessible via rather alarming wire bridges. Evidently, the side of the river that you were on was of considerable importance. So the river directionals were as follows. You had a term for downstream from where you are, where the speaker is, a term for upstream, a term for on the other bank of a river, on the other side of things, particularly rivers, on this side and on this bank. So you have a clear set of directionals in relation to rivers. So I've now represented this also on rivers. The rivers obviously flow from here to the Tibetan Plateau, and by and large go through huge gorges and end up in the valley of the Brahmaputra eventually. So if you are on the riverbank here, you are upstream and downstream, and you will have the different types of across the river as well. So rivers play an important role in Edo society, because all the original 6 clans were based along 6 major river valleys, and originally it looks like there were 6 sub-dialects which corresponded to the rivers. So clearly these have begun to merge, but still rivers play this important role in the directional system. Apart from rivers, obviously you have villages, which are, and even an individual villages are pretty scattered. They're distributed up and down the side of the mountain, and it can be sometimes a considerable walk from one level to another. However, upper and lower are not just geographical, they also mark social and lineage distinctions, so they also have distinctive directional terms. These are Angocha towards the upper part of the village, and Gopo towards the lower part of the village. And you can see here the use of Angopo in a sentence context. By the way, in this case, this might be better thought of as some sort of adjective, since you always have to precede a word actually also telling you which side. So you say downside side. In other words, it appears to be slightly redundant. So here are the directionals in relation to the village, approximately mapped out. And finally, Edo has obviously the concept of handedness, the right side and the left side, and these are pretty much similar to English. You can have Ichanyu, for example, on the right side, so that describes the position of the room in a locative way, but you can also have Lakenyu, left side, standing for a noun itself. So it just stands alone, meaning on the left or on the left side, something like that. So that's pretty close to the English concept. It doesn't really imply significant directionality. So perhaps conclusions, perhaps unexpectedly, movement verbs in Edo are relatively simple. They do not reflect the environment. The conventional deictics in Edo are also quite sparse, quite closely resemble those in English. The real lexical richness and diversity is in the systems relating to mountains and plains, to rivers and villages, and this strongly reflects the steep environments which the Idu traditionally inhabited. It's worth mentioning that these, I only alluded to this briefly, but all these things have an important spiritual significance. Falling off a mountain to your death is an important way of entering the underworld, and a special part of the underworld is reserved for such people. And similarly, the whole social system of the Idu relates to these up and down terms, and in particular to spirituality, because the higher you go up the mountain, the more spiritual you are, and all the most important shamans, for example, have to climb up to the Tibetan Plateau in order to receive enlightenment. So there's a lot of spiritual connections to directional vocabulary. From what we know, the neighboring Tani people also have a system which is related conceptually, although there are apparently no common lexical items. One of the interests of the Tani is that all the Tani peoples are a complex network of related peoples. Some are, like the Adi, are oriented in relation to north and south the same way as the Idu, but others are, because the chain of mountains turns an abrupt, almost right-angled corner, the whole orientation switches so that east, west, and north, south swap around. So I haven't fully understood how that works in terms of the the Tani system, but one can imagine it corresponds in some way to the Idu system. And it's likely that similar directional systems are widespread in the region, though from my search of the literature so far, there's not a lot of writing about this. So thanks to Mite Lingi and Hindu Memi and Roying for long-term assistance. Thanks to the Idu Mishmi Linguistic and Cultural Society for hosting various presentations of ongoing work. I must say it's enjoyable to get constant feedback in the field. So thank you very much.